Now, a group pushing for tax reform is Heritage Action for America. That's a conservative group based in Washington. And Michael Needham is its CEO. He joins me now from the group's headquarters. Let me start by asking about the timetable first. You heard Steve Dennis there outlining what Republican leadership would like to see happen. Of course, reality intercedes. What's your sense of a timetable for tax reform so far as you know it?
Yeah, I think it will be by the end of the year. First, they'll come back from August recess. September, early October, will be focused on the budget and the fiscal side of things. Before you can move to tax reform, the Congress has to pass a budget, set a revenue baseline, spin off reconciliation instructions from that budget, which will allow the 50-vote threshold to be used in the Senate rather than the 60-vote threshold. So that work will happen in September, early October, and then October, November, hopefully before December, I think will be the timeline when you actually see the real tax reform package come together and get signed by the president.
Michael, to what extent are you and your colleagues involved in this process? Do you feel like you've been brought into the fold? You've had a seat at the table as all of this has been hammered out? I mentioned that joint statement on tax reform, which we saw last week. Do you feel like you had a say as that was being written?
Yeah, I think it's a better process than the process on health care reform. As you recall, in March, when the House first rolled out their health care bill, everybody was kind of taken by surprise. There was a lot of criticism early on that came out. On this one, the White House has had key stakeholders over a lot. The Senate, the House, all the key stakeholders have been brought in. I was in with the Speaker last Friday, have been over by the White House. So I think there's a much better collaborative process of trying to get people on the same page, and I think that will hopefully lead to a much better result than the healthcare fiasco.
We talked to Grover Norquist a few days ago. He was at that meeting as well on Friday with the House Speaker Paul Ryan. Are you all on the same page? When you look at conservative groups who are advocating for, want to see some change when it comes to tax policy, are you speaking with a unified voice?
Yeah, I think, there's certainly, I don't know every position that Grover holds, but certainly we're all in the same business. We're all looking to cut taxes. And, I think as you look at this, there's minor disagreements in Washington on issues of, is it temporary, is it permanent? Do you do full expensing? Do you do something maybe short of that, permanent bonus depreciation? There are certainly issues that need to be worked out. But unlike health care, where there were some Republicans who just want to keep the regulatory architecture of Obama in place, or other Republicans who wanted to keep President Obama's big Medicaid expansion in place. On tax reform, we all want the same thing. It's about sitting down and figuring out how much from column A and how much from column B is going to be put in the final package. So I think it'll be a much easier deal to strike than the health care bill was.
What's your message to your donors, to your funders, about how you're going to approach this going forward, how you're going to deploy resources? We talked to Tim Phillips from Americans for Prosperity. He outlined the push that his organization is going to be doing here to explain tax reform to the American people. You mentioned expensing or the border-adjusted tax. These are terms that can make one's eyes glaze over a little bit here. How do you make this something that is understandable to people who don't follow tax policy on a day-to-day basis? What kind of resources are you going to deploy to do that?
Yeah, we're going to put all of our resources into it. We've got a nationwide grassroots network. We're going to be using all of our messaging tools. At the end of the day, this is about growth. I think the American people fundamentally understand that when President Trump talks about getting to 3–4% growth, that's what's actually needed to get jobs moving in this economy, to get our debt under control. America's spending problems can't be solved if you're looking at 1.9% growth, which is what Barack Obama assumed in his last budget. If you want to turbocharge the economy, if you want to get baseline 3–4% growth so that people can have great jobs, we can start solving our spending problems in a kind of slower, more responsible way. We need to unleash that growth. That's what President Trump's regulatory rollback has been about, and that's what tax reform is about. It's about creating jobs. It's about creating opportunity for everybody across the country.
How important to you is urgency? I look back to that health care fight. There was a real push there at the end to get something through. I think a lot of people might say maybe the Senate was moving too fast on that issue, despite the fact that this has been talked about for 7 years. The push toward that legislation happened pretty quickly. How important is urgency or this timetable to you? Do you think that by prolonging this, that makes it less likely you get tax reform, or more likely as stakeholders have more chances, more opportunities to talk about what they want?
Well, I think you need time to message and explain what you're doing, but also nothing happens in Washington without urgency. Washington's going to always try to kick the can down the road. The forces of the status quo are very powerful in this town. On health care, I think many of us underestimated just how many Republicans supported keeping Obamacare in place, and that certainly caused the first 7 months to go in a disastrous fashion. On tax reform, the urgency is there politically. The Republican Party needs that it needs a win, knows it needs a win. Trump has been very clear from the start of his campaign that growth is what his administration is about. OMB Director Mick Mulvaney just had a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about all of the policies of the Trump administration that will unleash growth. And from a policy standpoint, tax reform is something that Congress wants to deliver on. So I think there's much more of a unified effort here, and that urgency will be necessary to ultimately get Congress to move, because that's always their last option, is governing.
Michael, great to speak with you. Thank you very much for taking the time to explain what your organization's doing. Michael Needham, their CEO of Heritage Action for America, joining us from Washington, D.C. And coming up, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro denies allegations of vote tampering and vows to convene his new assembly tomorrow. The latest on what's happening there next. This is Bloomberg.
Everybody has a flashlight, but can your flashlight do this? Or how about this? The Bell & Howell Tactical Flashlight can, similar to flashlights